Well, hello and welcome everyone to the second episode of the Small Town Church Pastors Vlog. My name is Keith Robinson. I'm the pastor of the Cave City Christian Church in Cave City, Kentucky. And joining me is Nate Babcock, the pastor of Buchanan Christian Church in Buchanan, Michigan. If you missed out the first episode of our series, we dived into a little bit of the connection between the two of us and what we are trying to accomplish with this. Basically, our hope, our goal is that through our dialogue with one another, that the two of us learn from one another and our roles as ministers, but also more broadly that our congregations and whoever else happens to join us on this journey are encouraged, strengthened, bolstered, and learn a little bit more about some of the things that we might not necessarily be able to broach in the midst of a sermon or a regular Bible study, that we can dive into some of those other topics and in more detail than we might normally do so. Today, we are going to start off on a little mini series looking at the book of Nehemiah, talking about church leadership and how Nehemiah's role as a leader within the Jewish community gives us an example for that. And Nate is going to be primarily leading us through that discussion. So I will turn it over to you.
All right, Keith, it's good to talk to you. And I'm looking forward to this discussion on church leadership. And we will use Nehemiah as a reference point. He stands out in Scripture as an excellent, very capable leader in many ways that God used in some really remarkable ways in the life of the Jewish people as they were rebuilding after the return from exile. And so, well, at Buchanan Christian Church, we've been, our ministry staff in our staff meetings, which we have twice per month, we've been working our way through the book of Nehemiah, looking at his leadership from several different angles. And so Keith and I agreed that that would be a good thing to do here on the Small Town Pastors vlog. And so today we're going to begin with the topic of Nehemiah and passion and vision in leadership, which those are common topics in leadership literature, right?
Right.
Both through the church and more broadly. If you look at just about anything on leadership, these issues of passion and vision are going to come up. So when we look at Nehemiah, the question is, what are the concerns, the passions that drove Nehemiah in his work? So I'll probably be good to set the stage a little bit. Mm-hmm. Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem from Susa in the year 445 BC. He had been the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, king of the Persian Empire, which had replaced the Babylonian Empire as the dominant power in the ancient Near East. And so, again, what concerns drove Nehemiah? Why did he come back to Jerusalem from Susa? He had a pretty good job, right? I mean, being compared to the king, that there's some risk entailed with that job, but it's a pretty cushy position probably as well, right, Keith?
Right, and I think that actually is something that's worth mentioning here at the offset is, sometimes when we read that position, he's just a cupbearer, we envision that as being, he's just like at the bottom of the totem pole, he just has to serve the king kind of thing. But in the ancient world, that was a very well-respected position. It's something that he would have had to work his way up towards. The king is literally placing his life in this person's hands. So
it means the king trusts him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Nehemiah is coming from a position of he is well respected in the place he's at now. He is a leader to a certain extent, well before he goes into leadership in the city of Jerusalem, and he has done things to earn that, right? That he has placed himself or been placed in a position where he is trusted, he is respected. And that happens before he takes on the roles of all right, I'm going to tell all of these people what they need to do and when and how and why and all that stuff.
He had direct access to the king in a way that very few other people would have, being the king's cupbearer. And I think we should pause. I wanted to say this at the outset, and I forgot. Just try to briefly answer the question: what is leadership? John Maxwell says that leadership is influence, and in his words, no more and no less. I agree that leadership is influence, but I think when it comes to church leadership, we have to say a little bit more than that.
Right.
So church leadership, I think biblically is, church leaders are those men and women whom God has called and entrusted with the responsibility of guiding, protecting, caring for, teaching, and leading his church. Do you think that's accurate, Keith? This isn't something he and I talked about beforehand, but do you think think that sums it up well? Would you add anything?
I do. If we're using Maxwell's definition that you mentioned in the secular world, that leadership is influence over others. In the church world, leadership is God influencing others through us.
That's a good way to say it.
And I think using Nehemiah as an example, that abounds.
Right.
He is, as he's writing his book, constantly stopping to pray to God. God, will you remember me for this? Will you help me with this? Or God, will you watch over us for this? He's reminding other people about God's influence in his life and their lives. And yeah, when we talk about church leadership, it's not just that we're trying to influence or exert our influence on others, but that we're trying to point others to God. We're trying to have his influence come through us and influence others.
Yeah. And that's why the words called, right? That God called us to leadership in his church. And that leadership can take different forms, and there are different levels of leadership within the church. But this idea that God has moved in our hearts, that God has called us, and we'll see that in Nehemiah, right? He discerned that God was moving in his heart. It wasn't just his idea,
right?
But so that sense that God has called us, that we are responding to him and obeying him, and that God has entrusted something to us, right? That again, it's not about our own influence or what we hope to accomplish, but what God is doing and accomplishing. And he's entrusted us with a role to play in the work of his kingdom. So yeah, very, very important clarifications.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of the understanding of leadership, church leadership, that we're working with as we come to this discussion.
And as you and I had talked about before we started this, we, by coincidence, both of us had been preaching through, or currently preaching through, the book of Ephesians, which was not planned by either of us, other than just
didn't even talk about it.
But in Ephesians 4, it specifically talks about some of those leadership roles that God has given to the church. And again, it reiterates this idea that all of those leaders, apostles, prophets, teachers, pastors, they are there by God's direction. They're there to be used by God for his purposes, not their own. He says that they've been given for the equipping of the saints' service, so that the whole entire body is built up and strengthened and edified under this umbrella of one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And so, very much so that when we talk about leadership, as we're going to be doing over the next few sessions of this series, we are always, in the back of our minds at least, having this idea that what we are doing is just a reflection of what God has called us to do, and is what God is actually doing with us, just as the conduits.
Yes. So Nehemiah and passion and vision. So Nehemiah received this report while he's in Susa, serving as cupbearer to the king, that the city of Jerusalem and its people were in bad shape.
Mhm.
So I'm going to read a couple verses here from Nehemiah chapter 1 that contain that report, as well as Nehemiah's response. And they said to me, this is Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. So that's the negative report that Nehemiah received.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 4 gives us his response. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So Nehemiah received this news that the city of Jerusalem and its people were in bad shape. And he was deeply moved and greatly concerned for the situation, the condition of his people and the city of Jerusalem, as his response indicates. Mm-hmm. So it's out of this that Nehemiah's passion and vision for his work comes, and he discerns God moving him in his heart to do something about it, right? He spends these several days mourning, fasting, and praying before God, and then he decides to approach King Artaxerxes to talk to him about going back to Jerusalem. In Nehemiah's case, probably not going back to Jerusalem. He had probably never been there, right?
Right.
He was born probably in Susa, and so going to Jerusalem for the first time to lead in rebuilding the city.
Right.
So as we look at that, Keith, and as we think about what unfolds, as Nehemiah first goes to the king and then goes to Jerusalem and begins to go about his work, what are some of the specific concerns or passions which are driving him, do you think?
Well, one of the biggest ones is his concern for others. One of the things we've been discussing in our Wednesday night Bible study here is we've been going through the parables of Jesus, and over again in those parables, that theme comes out that we need to be focused on others. We need to be willing to place others before ourselves. And we see that here with Nehemiah. When this report comes to him about what's going on far away, we're talking 1,100 miles between Jerusalem and Susa. So probably also people that he either has never really met or spent much time interacting with. Maybe some of the ones that had been in Susa that left, he would know them a little bit, but by and large, these are people he doesn't know.
His only connection with them is they're Jews.
Right. Yeah, they're part of the same ethnic group. They're distant cousins,
right,
in some capacity. But his initial response when he hears about what's going on there is this deep, almost overwhelming grief. He is so concerned about them that he steps away from everything in his life to mourn for them, to pray, to fast, to try to reach out to God to see what's going on, what he can do. And I think that's then also the second passion of his concern for others, but his concern that God's will is done. He doesn't just jump right in and say, all right, what can I do to fix this? How can I, make this work, kind of thing. He takes an entire week to seek out God's will in the situation, to bring this to God in prayer and say, what is it that you want me to do? Or, what is it that you are doing just in general, whether I'm a part of it or not? So, I mean, his passion, his goal here is to help others, but also to see God's will be done in the situation. Yeah. And I think in practical, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, in practical terms, as leaders in the present day, those two things need to be our passions as well. Not that we want to, again, going back to what we said earlier, we don't want to exert our desires, our influences on the church or the world. We want to help others, and we want to see God's will be done through us in our situations.
So, and Keith, so many things you said there are so important. When many people you think of Nehemiah, and you probably think of just, oh, he's the guy that rebuilt the wall, right? Yeah, which is, it was a huge accomplishment,
right?
And it's one of the reasons that we look to Nehemiah as a model leader. But there's so much more to his leadership and to his passion and vision than the rebuilding of the wall. And at the deeper level, there are statements in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 5 in particular, where Nehemiah talks about walking in the fear of the Lord and his desire for the Jewish people there in and around Jerusalem to walk in the fear of the Lord. And he undertakes reforms during his leadership tenure in Jerusalem that aren't simply limited to rebuilding the wall, but they are reforms, they're moral, religious, spiritual reforms to lead the people toward being more obedient to God, to their covenant with God, to walking in his ways once again. So I think that's where we see just what you said, Keith. It starts out where he's seeking God in prayer, but it unfolds throughout his leadership, where I think the driving passion of Nehemiah's life was to walk in the fear of the Lord and to lead the Jewish people to do the same thing, right? And then secondly, as you were talking about his concern for others, when Nehemiah comes back when he goes to the king in chapter 2, the king observes that Nehemiah looks sad, right? And he hadn't been sad in the king's presence before. The king asks him about it, and he says, well, why shouldn't I be sad? My city's burnt down, and my people back in Jerusalem are in terrible shape. And the king says, well, what do you want? And Nehemiah says, I'd like you to send me to go to Jerusalem to rebuild it, right? And so his desire to rebuild the city is a desire for the city itself to be in good condition, safe, well secured, good living conditions, all of that again. But even more so, what that really means becomes more clear when in chapter 2, he, moving along there, I think it's like verses 9 and 10, he has made it back to Jerusalem, and the characters who are like the bad guys, right? What is it? Tobiah,
Balak, and Tobiah.
Yeah, the bad guys, right? The opponents, right? Throughout the book, they first come up there in chapter 2, like verse 9 or verse 10, and Nehemiah says that they were upset that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people, right? And so, fear of the Lord, that Nehemiah himself would walk in the Lord's ways, and that the Jewish people would, and that the welfare of their overall general welfare in every way. I think these were the driving concerns of Nehemiah's work and leadership.
Yes. Something else that stuck out to me while you were talking there is that Nehemiah embodies the idea of leadership as being a sacrifice. A lot of the leaders of his day and age, and still today as far as that goes, see leadership as a stepping point to build themselves.
Yes.
It's what can I get out of this? How can I exert more of my dominance? How can I, what benefits are there to me? But Nehemiah is in a position of great influence. He's this cupbearer to the king of Persia, who is the ruler of most of the world at that time. As cupbearer, he's also serving as an advisor to that king. So, just as the king grants his request here, if Nehemiah had asked for other things, he probably would have gotten them. He's coming from that position of great influence and almost dominance, and saying
wealth and comfort.
Right. And he's saying, I'm going to give that up.
Yes.
So that I can go someplace I've never been, to help people I've never met.
Yes.
Now, when he starts getting into that process, there's one point where he talks about the governors of the region before him used to take great taxes from the people that were placed under their charge. And Nehemiah forgoes doing that because the people can't afford it while he is there and they're doing all of this work. He is risking so much of what he could have for the sake of being able to see this passion and this vision brought about. And to me, that is just a truly remarkable thing to think about. That rather than try to build myself up, try to improve upon myself and my position, I'm going to lower myself. I'm going to bring myself down to a spot where, again, I'm putting other people first. I'm putting their needs above my own.
And this is, I'm sorry, I had to step out for a minute. There was a knock on my office door.
That's all right.
I mean, it's such a sharp distinction between worldly conception of leadership and the biblical conception of leadership.
Yes.
Right? And it just makes me think of, if you may have spoken, you may have referred to this while I stepped out there for a second, but when James and John come to Jesus in Mark chapter 10, Lord, grant that one of us may sit at your right and the other at your left, when you come into your kingdom. The end result of that is Jesus is telling them, you've got it all wrong, guys. Leadership isn't about ascending to greater. Leadership in my kingdom isn't about ascending to greater and greater positions of authority over others. It's about descending to lower and lower positions of service to others, right? Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for men. Right. Okay. So I think we've probably identified the passions and visions that were driving Nehemiah. Passions and vision, which were driving Nehemiah. So let's talk a little bit, Keith, about why passion and vision matter to church leadership. I mean, why would we spend an episode talking about this?
Well, I think at its most basic, if you are trying to lead in any capacity, really, whether we're talking secular or sacred, without a driving passion and without a vision, you are going directionless and meaningless. And some of this, I think, would seem somewhat common sense. If you have no vision for where you're going, then you're just moving in a direction, but that direction could be, veering far off course. It could be going somewhere you ultimately do not want to be. It could be going somewhere that's going to be detrimental to the people that you lead and are called to serve. And so without it, just the basic question, where are you going if you don't know? And the same with passion. Why are you going there if you don't have a desire to, a reason to? So I think those two questions are fundamental, because without them, we don't have a reason to be here, to be in this position in the first place.
Right. So it's about motivation. Why are we doing what we're doing? And direction. Where are we headed? What are we seeking to accomplish? And those are fundamental questions. And there really is no good leadership at any level of the church, whether we're talking about as ministers, as elders, as deacons, as small group leaders, as ministry team leaders. Passion and vision, motivation and direction are essential for leadership at in each of those areas. Why are we doing what we're doing, and where are we going? What are we seeking to accomplish? Because leadership is, as we'll see from Nehemiah in another episode or two, as Keith and I continue this conversation, leadership does involve, including in the church, it does involve motivating and mobilizing and equipping others to go somewhere, to accomplish something, right? And it's more than that, but it does include that. And vision and passion are much of the keys, not the only keys, but they're significant keys to that work of motivating and mobilizing and equipping people. So moving then from Nehemiah and answering that question about why do passion and vision matter in a general way, let's try to be more specific and reflecting on some New Testament texts here. What are the concerns which should drive us in Christian ministry? Because our specific passions aren't going to be the same probably as Nehemiah's. Right. Or at least the vision part of it isn't, right? Because we're not looking to rebuild a wall, right? Or reinstitute the proper sacrifices in the temple, So there are going to be some differences between us and Nehemiah. So what are the New Testament biblical imperatives for passion and vision in Christian leadership?
I think probably the biggest, or at least one of the biggest, is I'm trying not to just steal everything in your notes, but
steal away. That's why they're there, right?
Is a conversation that Jesus has on multiple occasions with different people. What is the greatest commandment? And this is, for reference, again, we've kind of talked about this on Wednesday nights over the last few weeks, because some of these conversations include the parables. In context, it's not a question that was unique to those specific interactions. It's a debate that was going on in the first century and the time immediately preceding it. All right, we have the 623 commands of God given to us in the law, but how do we know which one is the most important? Which one should we focus on and try to place all of the others under? How do we rank them? Kind of thing. It was as important of a conversation then as what our sort of hot button political topics are today. Mm-hmm. And there were multiple answers to those questions. Some of the rabbis immediately preceding Jesus would give a similar answer to what he did, but others had different ideas of what the greatest commands were. I think most notably would be the debate between rabbis Hillel and Shammai. Hillel gave a similar answer that Jesus did, that the greatest commands are to love God and love your neighbor. Shammai's answer was the greatest commands are to love God, but then to keep the Sabbath holy. That was, in his estimation, what you should focus on first. And he left out the part about loving your neighbor as yourself.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And so when that question is brought to Jesus on multiple occasions, he responds by saying that the entire law, all of what God has said prior, all that God desires, is summed up in the commands to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else rests upon those two fundamental ideas. And I think 2,000 years later, that still makes a great deal of sense. So what we do as church leaders, as people striving to, again, have God's will enacted through us, should be to focus on and bring other people to the focus on loving God and loving one another.
A long time ago, I had to answer the question, what do I want my life to be about? Mm-hmm. And I think this was probably in one of those exercises in like some spiritual formation class in Bible college, but this is what I came down on. And the greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself. And because Jesus so clearly answers that question, which, as Keith said, was commonly debated in his day, the Gospels give us those answers, and Jesus says, look, this is what's most important. It makes sense that that's what the church would be all about, loving God and loving others, forming, shaping people who follow Jesus. to be people who love God and love others. And so that absolutely should be one of our core convictions, one of our driving passions, one of our central visions for where we want to go and what we want to accomplish in church leadership. And again, this applies in every area of church leadership. It applies if you're leading a small group. You want to lead those people to grow in loving God and loving neighbor. It applies if you're an elder, right? You want to shepherd the congregation in such a way that that congregation grows in loving God and loving neighbor. It applies to Keith and I as preachers, right? That our aim in preaching is not just to disseminate information, right? So that we can win the round of Jeopardy when the Bible questions come up, right? So we're the only ones in the room that know the answer, right? Not just to disseminate information, but our preaching should lead toward forming people who are passionate about and growing and loving God and loving neighbor.
And I think to kind of give clarification on these two statements, then I've actually just had this conversation. So I feel like some people watching this is going to be a repeat of something we've just done recently, but that's perfectly all right.
Jesus said it more than once, Keith.
Yes. When we talk about love in the New Testament perspective, in English, we use the word love for all kinds of things.
I love ice cream.
Yeah, I love pizza. I love my family. I love, my favorite TV show, and and I think in the back of our minds we understand that we don't mean exactly the same thing when we're using those words. The love we have for pizza and ice cream is not the same as the love we have for our family, or at least I hope it's not the same. The Greek people figured out a way around this by having different words to describe these different things. And I won't go through all of them here, but the love that is being talked about here, when we say love God, love neighbor, the love that is mentioned when, John 3:16, God so loved the world, or 1 John, that God is love, or, that kind of love is a word that describes a love that does what is spiritually best for another. It's unconditional. There's no strings attached to it that, I'm going to do this if you reciprocate for me, or I'm going to do this so I can get something out of it. It's just purely, I want what's best for you, and I'm going to do it regardless of what it takes, regardless of what it means for me. And I'm stealing more from your notes, but one of the other things that you had mentioned is that one of our big goals to seek and to save the lost.
Yes.
Jesus gives that as his purpose statement. Why is the Son of Man here on earth? To seek and to save the lost.
Yes.
And that comes out of that idea that I love you, I want to do what's best for you, so I'm going to seek you out, I'm going to help you, I'm going to bring you back to where you need to be.
Yeah. So that's I'm glad you said that, Keith, because actually the love commands there's a certain logic to it in which they precede the evangelistic or mission mandate of the church, right? I'm only going to obey those commands, first of all, if I love God and I want to see his will done.
Right.
And secondly, if I love my neighbor enough that I care about their spiritual welfare and their eternal destiny, right? So it's love, which is the fountain, so to speak, of obedience to the Great Commission, right, in the evangelistic mandate of the church. But we do need to mention those also. The Son of Man Jesus did come to seek and to save the lost. Paul said later, I think it was 1 Timothy, right? This is a trustworthy saying and deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners.
Yes.
Right? So then, of course, Jesus, after his resurrection, gave marching orders, so to speak. We call it the Great Commission to his disciples which it's the inheritance of the whole church, not just those 12 men. It's the commission for the whole church.
Yes.
The Matthew 28 version is, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded you, right? Mm-hmm. So making disciples of all nations. The Markan version is go into all the world and preach the gospel of the whole creation. Mm-hmm. The version in Acts chapter 1 is, when you receive the Holy Spirit, you will receive power to be my witnesses, beginning in Jerusalem, in Judea, all Samaria, and stretching to the end of the earth. So, I didn't refer to the versions of Luke and John, but the point is that Jesus has clearly called his church to go into the world, the whole world, preach the good news of his life, death, resurrection, ascension, and enthronement as the King of Kings, and call people to follow him as Lord and Savior, and teach them how to do that, and fold them into the community of people who do that, the community of Jesus' disciples, Jesus' followers, which we call the church. Mm-hmm. So again, what is the passion and vision that should drive church leadership at every level? The desire to make Christ known, to proclaim the gospel, and to form people to be his disciples. And that has a local right here where we live in our own Jerusalem. For Keith, it's Cave City. For me, it's Buchanan. For you, it might be somewhere else. Right? But it begins where we're at, but it extends to the end of the earth. It's a universal mission that Jesus has given us.
Yes. Very much so. I agree. God certainly knew what he was doing, right? When he had all of these things written down so very long ago. We can stumble across and upon some of the nuances. How do we go about do that? We can debate, well, does it go this way? Does it go this way in this particular situation? But the overarching goal, the overarching theme has remained the same since the very beginning of time. Mm-hmm. Of our passion is to love God, to love neighbor, to do what is best and to do his will. And our vision is to bring others to him. Mm-hmm. This is the covenant he gave Abraham. Mm-hmm. This is the covenant he gave Moses. This is the covenant he gave through Jesus. It's never changed. Mm-hmm. It's just the way we word it and the way we express it changes as our culture, our situation changes.
So I think it would be good now for us, having covered some of the biblical groundwork. Mm-hmm. And I guess what we're hoping to reinforce is that this biblical groundwork is essential, right? Each congregation is probably going to word it a little bit differently. As Keith was saying, churches have mission statements and vision statements. Each leader might articulate it for himself or herself a little bit differently, depending on context and role. Right. But if you are in church leadership, these basic concerns, loving God and neighbor, bringing others to him, preaching the gospel, making disciples, these are non-negotiables, right? And this goes back to what Keith and I were talking about earlier about being called, right? And God exerting his influence on others through us. There's a very fundamental sense in which we don't get to decide what the vision is for the church, right? Or what the mission is for the church, or what it is that motivates the church to do the work she's called to do. That's not up to us. God's already revealed that in his word, and our responsibility is to obey, right? To do what he's called us to do. So this isn't like we're not, just creating this stuff out of thin air, right? In church leadership, it's already been given to us, and it is our responsibility to adapt and apply those biblical imperatives, those commands, in the right ways in our context. In many ways, these questions have already been answered for us, and we just need to be clear about that in our understanding.
Yep.
Yeah. So I thought it would be good, Keith, for us to spend a few moments as we begin to wind this conversation down.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it would be good for us to spend a few moments discussing where and how the application of or practice in these areas of passion and vision can go wrong in church leadership, because it certainly has gone wrong and it can go wrong.
Yes.
So what do you think? What are some pitfalls to avoid, some problem areas when we're talking about passion and vision?
Well, I think, we can come up with a lot of different examples for it, but they're all going to somewhat boil down to the same problem. And that problem is when we neglect or forget those driving passions and visions that we've just talked about. When you cease to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself, when you cease to make your goal be to seek and to save the lost, to go into the world and make disciples, you're going to replace it with something. And
yes, you are.
And that something is going to not be what God intends.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that is, I want to seek to promote myself, I want to make a name for myself, I want to get rich and famous, I want to, help my friend along and place him in a position or her in a position that perhaps they shouldn't be in, or whether it's this idea that, well, I have been called to this, so that must mean that I am always right on everything I say.
Yeah, the I'm always right complex.
Yes. It's always a breakdown of this driving passion and vision and replacement of it with something else.
Yeah. So self-centered leadership, where it's all about me and it's self-promotion.
Yes.
Right? Leadership that is unwilling to listen to others' ideas, because I already know what the vision is and I've got it all figured out and I don't need you. Right.
Right.
That's not very loving toward God or neighbor.
Right.
Leadership that is unwilling to listen to criticisms of the vision or even just questions about the vision. Right. How dare you question my vision? How dare you criticize my vision? Right. Again, that's not a loving or humble posture. It's not a Christ-like posture for a leader.
And I think what happens in those situations is that, part of it again is this breakdown of what the vision and the passion should be. Part of it is also a lack of, I guess, I don't know how I want to word this, a lack of investment in it from yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But if you aren't able to accept the questions and critique of others or the input of others, if you have to be the one who is always right and always in charge, that says something about where you are at in your faith and your understanding of God.
Yeah.
Because again, you're no longer trying to put God's will first and saying, I love him with all my heart, soul, mind, strength. It's I'm trying to put myself first, or I don't know if I can trust God with all of my heart and all of my mind. So I'm going to reserve a piece of it for myself and try to hold on to it and use it to the best of what I think it should happen here. And
often unresolved insecurities, unhealed wounds, undisciplined ambitions are what drive that kind of behavior.
Yes.
And this is something I've been thinking a lot about in recent years. I've tried to give it attention to it in my own life, and that is the areas of mental and emotional health and maturity. And this episode isn't about that, but it factors in is an area where it's often neglected, frankly, in the formation of Christian leaders at every level, again, ministers, elders. We often don't pay attention to those beneath the surface factors of what really drives our behavior and our decision making. And it's often those insecurities, those wounds, those ambitions, or other issues that are beneath the surface we're not paying attention to, but they actually drive a lot of what we do, and they can end up causing us to behave in areas such as passion and vision, causing us to behave in controlling, domineering, manipulative ways, right? And cause us to be kind of all caught up on our own image or our own authority, which again is not what Christian leadership is about.
Right. And Jesus called this out in a lot of the existing leaders of his day. You see how he interacts with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of these others. And we get statements about how, Jesus knew what was in that person's heart. Or, he says, inwardly, you are just full of death and decay.
Dead men's bones. Yeah.
While outwardly, you're just whitewashed tombs, kind of thing. And we often fall into the same trap of, on the outside, this person or this group of people seems like they're all put together. They have everything going for them. They know what they're doing. So let's thrust them into a position because they're going to be good for the role. We can tell by the way they look. But if we don't dive into those deeper issues and see, what's below the surface, we could end up finding ourselves in a lot of trouble down the road with somebody that's truly not qualified for that, or not capable for that, or who isn't willing to give of themselves in the way they should. Now, granted, you and I are not Jesus, so we can't see into the heart of a person the way that he could. But this is still something that we should strive to do to the best of our ability in our own lives, and when we are having this discussion about leadership in general in the lives of those around us.
Well, and the access we do have, of course, is by their fruits you shall know them.
Yes.
And so the unwillingness to listen, the defensiveness, even anger in response to criticism or questions, the willingness to basically trample other people to accomplish the vision, right? These are fruits of areas of a person's inner life that haven't been disciplined by Christ and transformed by the Holy Spirit. Right? That's so. And so I guess what we want to say to ourselves, because Keith and I are admonishing each other, but also to those of you who are a part of this conversation with us, is, first of all, if you are in a position of leadership within the church, it's your responsibility to attend to those issues, and in yourself, right? To see to it that you are allowing the Spirit to work in the deep places in your being, so that on the inside, your heart and mind and will, you are being conformed to the likeness of Christ, so that the fruit that is produced is gentleness and kindness and patience and all of those other things that Paul lists in Galatians, right? And to get help with that, if you need it, right, from a pastor, a counselor, a trusted friend, brother or sister in Christ, to get help in that journey. And secondly, we want to say that if you are interacting with a leader that displays these characteristics, who in the name of passion or vision is controlling, angry, dominant, manipulative, that you need to understand what you're dealing with, right? Now, what are the appropriate steps to take in response to that? We're probably not going to go into that in this conversation, but at least this can be a heads up to you. Hey, just because this person is the pastor or the elder or the small group leader doesn't authorize them to behave in non-Christian ways on behalf of accomplishing a Christian vision, right? Yeah. All right. Well, I think we will circle back around to this conversation, at least in some ways, when we come to the subject of Nehemiah and his work in motivating and mobilizing others, because passion and vision play a significant role in motivating and mobilizing others. in leadership.
Right.
So that's one topic that we have coming up. I think that will be a couple of episodes from now. Our next episode will be about the role that prayer and faith played in Nehemiah's life and leadership, and what role should prayer and faith play in our life and leadership.
So it's definitely something that I'm looking forward to. And, again, kind of going back to, again, our discussion on passion and vision, these driving forces of putting God's will first, loving him with everything we have, prayer and faith have to come before leadership and any level in the church. You cannot lead in the church if you do not have a strong, firmly founded, grounded faith, and a faith that is willing to pray, to constantly seek God's will and God's guidance in the situation that you are leading in. You cannot lead if God is not leading you.
So I try to remind myself, before I'm a minister, a preacher, I'm a disciple of Jesus. Before I'm a minister or preacher, I'm a child of God. And I cannot preach or lead with any kind of integrity if I am not first growing in my relationship with Jesus, pursuing God, and seeking to know and love and obey him more and more. So, and oftentimes this happens in leadership where we get this all out of whack, right? And often Christian leaders and church leaders will neglect their own personal relationship with God for the sake of leading others in their relationship with God.
Right.
But as Keith has said, that calculus doesn't work, right? that gets things completely messed up, and it leads to all kinds of very serious consequences.
Right. And I think, and we'll touch on this more in later episodes as well, I think this is why all congregations need to have multiple leaders.
Yeah.
Because often the reason for that, of trying to lead others while not growing myself, is busyness. There's this to do and this to do and this to do, and it's easy to throw out my personal time with God, and to be okay with doing that because I'm doing things for God.
For God, yeah.
But that's Martin Luther, who isn't really connected to our movement per se. For those of you who don't know, Martin Luther was a Catholic priest who was sort of forced to leave the Catholic Church in 1500s, 1600s because he saw problems going on that he wanted to correct. This is where the Reformation movement gets its start, where the Lutheran Church gets its start. He is a very interesting fellow. I encourage you to look him up sometime if you.
He is very interesting. He's fascinating.
But one of the things that I remember, just sort of this offhand quote of Martin Luther's that very much applies in a situation like this, is that he would say, "I am too busy not to pray."
Yeah, I've seen that also.
I have so much going on in my life today that I should spend an extra hour in prayer first to get myself set up for it.
Right.
And I think, if more of us had that frame of mind, that we need to keep developing our own relationship. We need to keep emphasizing our own growth as we are trying to do other things. Some of the issues that come up, again, that we'll be discussing later on, wouldn't come up because God is going to be right there in the midst, and we're all going to be focusing on him and pointing to him as we try to deal with those things.
Yep, for sure. I look forward to that conversation, Keith.
I do as well. Thank all of you for joining us on this little journey. Feel free, if you have any comments or insight, to leave those below or to message either of us directly. We would love to hear from you, get some feedback on what we are doing that is encouraging to you, or things that we could maybe improve upon to make this a more meaningful experience for you. We will resume in a couple of weeks with the topic of Nehemiah and prayer and faith.
Well, and let me say, Keith, before you sign us off,
yes,
if you know people who are in church leadership, ministers, elders, small group leaders, others that you think would enjoy and benefit from these conversations that Keith and I are having, please share, right?
Yeah.
Please share. Okay.
It's public, it's available for everybody, and we'd be happy to have you join us on our journey here. Until next time.
Yep.